Have you ever considered what a true gift is? Not the object wrapped in paper, not the transactional token of occasion, but the kind of gift that arrives shrouded in the quiet dignity of understanding. The kind that isn't meant to be owned, but to be used. It is a key, offered by a stranger who somehow sees the lock on your own heart. We spend so much of our lives building walls to protect a central wound, decorating the ramparts with routine and silence until the fortress becomes a prison. We forget that the world outside still turns, that storms still gather, and that sometimes the thing that will save us will not be a reinforcement of our defenses, but the small, insistent cry of another's need, carried on the wind. This is a story about such a man who had hollowed himself out to make room for a ghost, and the gift that taught him not how to forget, but how to plant his sorrow in the earth and watch it grow into something new. His name was Elias, though the name had grown unfamiliar on his own tongue, a relic of a life lived by another man in another time. Now, he was simply a shape against the mountain, a creature of habit and shadow, carved from the same silence as the ancient pines that stood sentinel around his cabin. The mountain was his keeper and his confessor, a vast, indifferent god of granite and ice that asked nothing of him but his presence, and in return gave him the immense, echoing solace of its emptiness. His days were measured not by a clock, but by the slow pilgrimage of the sun across the sky. He rose with its pale, hesitant light, his movements methodical, each action a worn stone in the riverbed of his routine, stoking the fire, fetching water, checking his snares. His hands, calloused and mapped with the fine lines of a hard life, were rarely still. When they were not occupied with the tasks of survival, they were engaged in a single, devotional act. From a block of pale, fragrant pine, he was coaxing a face. It was the same face he had been carving for 5 years, the ghost he had made a home for. Her face. He would work for hours, the blade of his knife whispering against the wood, shaving away slivers that curled to the floor like fallen wishes. He knew the curve of her cheek, the gentle sweep of her brow, the way a faint smile played at the corners of her lips even in repose. He knew these things as he knew the patterns of the stars or the feel of the coming snow. Yet, the carving remained unfinished. He could never bring himself to shape the eyes. To do so would be to give it sight, to invite it to look back at him, and he was not strong enough to bear that gaze. So the face remained a beautiful, blind mask, a monument to a memory he refused to let live, yet could not bear to let die. The cabin itself was an extension of his grief, a vessel filled with a profound and heavy quiet. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke, pine resin, and the dust of lonely years. Light struggled through the single, grimy windowpane, illuminating the motes that danced in its slanted beams, each one a tiny, forgotten world. This was his stasis, a life lived in the amber of sorrow, perfectly preserved and perfectly dead. He had asked the world for nothing but to be left alone, and the world, in its vast and terrible generosity, had granted his wish. He believed this solitude was his penance and his shield, the only thing he had left to control. He was wrong. The wilderness is not a void, it is a presence, and it was about to remind him that even the most carefully constructed walls can be breached by the simple, undeniable force of a life in need. The storm came without warning, a rabid animal of wind and snow that threw itself against the mountain. It was not the patient, blanketing snow of deep winter, but a sudden, violent squall, a tantrum of nature that ripped through the valley with a shriek. The sky, moments before a placid slate gray, was now a churning cauldron of black and bruised purple. Elias watched from his window as the world dissolved into a maelstrom of white. The pines thrashed, their branches groaning under the assault, and the wind howled a polyphony of grief and rage that seemed to speak the language of his own heart. He turned from the window, the storm outside a mere echo of the one that had lived inside him for years. He added another log to the fire, the crackle and hiss a welcome counterpoint to the gale. He settled back into his chair, picking up the block of wood, the unfinished face. Here, in this small act, was his anchor. The storm could tear the sky apart, but in his hands, this memory was safe, unchanging. But then he heard it. At first, it was a flicker of sound, so thin and sharp he thought it was a branch snapping in the wind or the cry of a hawk caught in the tempest. He paused, his knife hovering over the wood, his head tilted. He listened, holding his breath. The wind howled, a long, mournful note, and then, underneath it, the sound came again. It was higher, more desperate than any animal cry. It was human. It was the sound of a child. For a long moment, Elias did not move. His carefully constructed world, the one of silence and routine, tilted on its axis. To open the door was to let the storm in. Not just the storm of wind and snow, but the storm of the world of pain and need and connection he had so painstakingly fled. Every instinct screamed at him to ignore it, to dismiss it as a phantom of the wind, to retreat deeper into the safety of his solitude. The ghost in his heart whispered for him to stay, to protect what little he had left. The cabin, once his sanctuary, suddenly felt like a cage. The sound came a third time, weaker now, frayed at the edges, threatening to be swallowed whole by the roaring wind. It was a sound of pure terror, of life clinging to a thread. And in that moment, something ancient and deeply buried within him broke through the permafrost of his grief. It was the part of him that was a man before he was a widower, the part that was human before he was a hermit. He could not carve the eyes of his lost love, but he could not be blind to the suffering of the living. He placed the carving down on the small, rough-hewn table with a reverence that was almost prayer-like. Then, he stood, his movements no longer slow and measured, but filled with a sudden, sharp purpose. He pulled on his thickest coat, his worn leather boots, and grabbed the oil lantern from its hook by the door. The man who had spent 5 years shutting the world out was about to walk directly into its screaming, violent heart. The choice was not a choice at all. It was an imperative. The force of the wind nearly tore the cabin door from his hand as he wrenched it open. The storm lunged at him, a physical blow of ice and air that stole his breath and stung his eyes. The world beyond his threshold was a formless, roaring chaos of white. The sound that had called him out was immediately devoured by the gale, leaving him with only the memory of its direction. He pulled his collar tight against his neck, lowered his head, and stepped out into the tempest, the lantern casting a feeble, dancing circle of gold against the blinding snow. The cold was a living thing, a predator with teeth of ice that bit deep into his flesh. Every step was a battle. The snow was already deep, a treacherous blanket hiding rocks and roots, and the wind pushed against him with the weight of a physical being, trying to force him back, to send him scurrying to the false safety of his shelter. He pressed on, guided by a ghost of a sound and a flicker of instinct. The landscape he knew as intimately as his own hands was rendered alien, its familiar contours erased by the swirling white. He was navigating by feel, by the slope of the land and the shape of the trees that loomed like skeletal specters in the gloom. He called out, his voice a raw, desperate thing that the storm snatched from his lips and tore to shreds. There was no answer but the ceaseless howl of the wind. Doubt began to creep in, a cold more piercing than the wind. Had he imagined it? Was this a fool's errand, a penance for a grief so profound it had begun to create phantoms? He stumbled, his foot catching on a hidden root, and fell to one knee in the deep snow. The lantern flickered wildly, threatening to extinguish. For a moment, he stayed there, the snow piling up around him, the immense, crushing weight of the storm and his solitude bearing down on him. It would be so easy to turn back. It would be so easy to surrender. But then, through a momentary lull in the wind scream, he heard it again. Closer this time. A whimper. It was real. Galvanized, he pushed himself to his feet and plunged forward, moving toward the sound. He found them huddled in the lee of a massive granite boulder, two small figures pressed so tightly together they seemed to be a single entity. They were little more than shivering bundles of hide and wool, their faces pale, their dark eyes wide with a terror so profound it had frozen beyond tears. They were Apache girls, he knew instantly from their dress and the fine, beaded patterns on their worn moccasins. The older one, perhaps 7 or 8 years of age, held the younger, who couldn't have been more than 4, in a fierce, protective embrace. Their hair, long and black as a raven's wing, was laced with snow. They did not cry out when they saw him, a huge, bearded shape emerging from the blizzard. They simply watched, their silence more potent than any scream. Elias's heart, a muscle he had thought long dormant, seized in his chest. He saw not just 2 lost children, but the terrifying fragility of life itself, a truth he had tried for 5 years to outrun. He knelt before them, moving slowly, deliberately, so as not to frighten them further. He held out the lantern, its warm light falling on their small, frozen faces. He said nothing. There were no words for this. He simply opened his coat, a silent offering of warmth and shelter. He carried the smaller girl, her tiny body a rigid knot of cold against his chest, while the older one clung to the back of his coat, her small hand clutching a fistful of wool as if it were a lifeline. The journey back to the cabin was a primal struggle, a desperate pilgrimage against the full fury of the storm. Elias was no longer just a man, he was a shield, a vessel of warmth, his own body a bulwark against the screaming void that sought to claim the two small lives in his care. The wind tore at him, trying to rip them from his grasp, but he bent his head and pushed forward, his feet finding their purchase in the deep snow through sheer will alone. Each step was a prayer, each breath a victory. The feeble light of his cabin, a distant, hazy star in the blizzard, was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. When he finally stumbled through the door and kicked it shut against the storm, the sudden silence was deafening. It was a thick, warm, breathing silence, profoundly different from the empty quiet that had occupied the space moments before. He gently set the little one down near the hearth, her body so stiff with cold he feared she might break. The older girl stood by the door, a small, wary sentinel, her dark eyes tracking his every move. He did not speak. He moved with a quiet efficiency, his actions becoming a language of care. He stripped off their soaked outer garments, his large, rough hand surprisingly gentle. He wrapped them both in the thickest wool blankets he owned, cocooning them until only their small, pale faces were visible. He placed them on the worn rug before the fire, its flames a roaring, vibrant heart in the center of the small room. The light danced across the cabin walls, chasing the shadows into the corners. It illuminated the unfinished carving on the table, the blind face seeming to watch the scene with a silent, sorrowful grace. The cabin, for so long a mausoleum for one, had become a sanctuary for three. Elias busied himself, stoking the fire until it blazed, putting a pot of water on to heat. He moved around the small space, acutely aware of the two pairs of eyes that followed him. They were a presence, a weight, a warmth that pushed against the cold emptiness inside him. He felt their fear, a palpable thing in the air, but he also felt their resilience. He prepared a thin broth, its savory steam filling the room, and offered it to them in 2 wooden bowls. The older girl took them, her movements hesitant but deliberate. She helped her younger sister, her small hands guiding the bowl to the little one's lips. They drank, their shivering slowly subsiding in the enveloping warmth of the fire. Hours passed in this silent tableau. Outside, the storm raged, its voice a constant, impotent roar against the sturdy walls of the cabin. Inside, a fragile peace began to settle. The girls, exhausted and safe, eventually drifted to sleep, their small bodies curled together under the blankets, their breathing soft and even. Elias sat in his chair, watching them. The firelight flickered across their sleeping faces, smoothing away the lines of fear and leaving only the profound innocence of childhood. In their presence, the ghost that haunted him seemed to recede, her silent judgment replaced by a simple, overwhelming duty to protect. The mountain man, the hermit, the man who had walled himself in with grief, had become a guardian. The storm had brought him not destruction, but life. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the world scoured clean and draped in a blanket of profound, unbroken white. The sun rose into a sky of crystalline blue, its light glittering on the snow-laden pines with a brilliance that was almost painful to behold. A deep silence had fallen over the mountain, the kind of quiet that follows a great and terrible noise. Inside the cabin, the 2 girls were awake. They sat by the hearth, still wrapped in their blankets, their dark eyes wide and curious as they took in their surroundings. The fear of the previous night had softened into a quiet watchfulness. Elias moved about the cabin, his routine altered by their presence. He made a simple breakfast of dried meat and berries, rehydrated into a warm, sweet stew. He placed the bowls before them and retreated to his side of the room, giving them space. He did not want to intimidate them with his size or his silence. He picked up his carving, the familiar weight of the wood in his hands a small comfort. He sat in his chair and began to work, his knife making its soft, whispering sounds. He tried to lose himself in the familiar lines of the face, but his awareness was fixed on the 2 small figures across the room. He could feel their gaze on him. He was a strange, wild creature to them, a bearded giant in a wooden cave. The younger girl remained huddled close to her sister, but the older one's curiosity began to outweigh her caution. She watched his hands, her head tilted as she observed the slow, deliberate movements of the knife. She watched the face emerge from the wood, her expression unreadable. After a long while, when she had finished her meal, she rose and slowly, hesitantly, crossed the space between them. She stopped beside his chair, so close he could feel the faint warmth of her body. She did not speak. She simply pointed a small, slender finger at the carving in his hands. Her touch was featherlight as her finger traced the line of the unfinished woman's jaw. It was a gesture of profound, intuitive understanding. She looked from the carving up to his face, her dark eyes holding his for the first time. In their depths, he saw not fear, but a flicker of shared sorrow, a wisdom far beyond her years. It was a silent question: who was she? Elias felt his throat tighten. For 5 years, no one had seen his grief. It had been his secret, his shadow companion. But this child, a stranger brought by the storm, saw it. She saw the hollow place inside him and recognized its shape. He could not answer her with words. The story was too heavy, its edges too sharp to be spoken aloud. Instead, he simply stopped carving and turned the block of wood over in his hands, showing her the smooth, unmarked back. Then he reached out and gently, with the tip of his finger, traced the shape of a single, falling tear beneath one of the carving's sightless eyes. It was an admission. A confession. The girl watched his finger, then looked back to his face. A flicker of understanding passed between them, a bridge of empathy built in the quiet space of shared loss. She gave a small, solemn nod. She did not need to know the name or the story. She understood the feeling. She reached out and placed her small hand on his arm, a gesture of comfort so simple and so powerful it felt as though it might restart his frozen heart. In that moment, the carving was no longer just a monument to his pain, it became a point of connection, a shared language between a broken man and a lost child. The silence in the cabin was no longer empty. It was full. The sun was high in the sky the next day when a figure appeared at the edge of the clearing. Elias saw her first, a lone woman standing motionless against the brilliant backdrop of snow. She was tall and slender, wrapped in a heavy wool blanket, her bearing one of immense dignity and strength. There was no sign of panic or desperation in her posture, only a deep, unyielding resolve. She was the mother. The moment the older girl saw her, she let out a small cry, a sound that was half relief and half joy. She scrambled to her feet and ran to the door, her sister stumbling sleepily behind her. Elias opened the door for them, and they burst out into the snow-bright clearing, their small legs churning through the deep powder. The woman knelt, her arms opening wide, and gathered her daughters into her embrace. The reunion was silent, a tableau of profound emotional weight against the vast, impassive landscape. She held them for a long time, her face buried in their hair, her body a shield around theirs. Elias watched from the doorway of his cabin, feeling like an intruder on a sacred moment. He had expected tears, frantic questions, a dramatic outpouring of emotion. But there was only this deep, powerful stillness, a bond that needed no words to affirm its strength. After a long moment, the woman rose, her hand still resting on her daughter's shoulders. She looked across the clearing at Elias. Her face was weathered by the sun and wind, etched with lines of worry, but her eyes were clear and steady. They held his gaze, and in that look, an entire conversation passed between them. He saw her gratitude, a thing so immense and profound it was humbling. He saw her respect for his solitude, an understanding that he was a man who lived apart from the world. But he also saw something else, something deeper. She was not just looking at him, she was looking into him. Her gaze seemed to pierce through the layers of beard and silence and sorrow, seeing the man huddled within. It was the same intuitive sight her daughter possessed, and it was deeply unsettling and strangely comforting all at once. She spoke a few quiet words to her children in her own tongue, and they stood back, their hands clutching hers. Then, she began to walk toward him, her steps sure and even in the deep snow. She stopped a few feet from his door. She did not offer thanks in his language. She did not need to. Her presence was thanks enough. From beneath her blanket, she produced a small, carefully wrapped bundle. It was a package made of soft, tanned deerskin, tied with a simple leather thong. She held it out to him, not as payment, not as a trade, but as an offering. It was a gift. Elias hesitated for only a second before reaching out and taking it. The bundle was surprisingly heavy for its size, and cool to the touch. He held it in his hands, this mysterious object from a world he had long since abandoned. He looked from the gift to the woman's face. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of finality and peace. Then, without another look, she turned, gathered her daughters to her side, and began the long walk back the way she had come. Elias stood in his doorway, the small bundle in his hands, and watched them until their 3 dark figures were swallowed by the blinding white of the snow. He stood in the doorway for a long time after they were gone, the deerskin bundle resting in his palms. The clearing was empty again, the only trace of their presence the 3 sets of footprints leading away into the vast, silent wilderness. The silence that returned to the cabin was different now. Before, it had been a heavy, suffocating blanket of absence. Now, it felt lighter, as if the small, vibrant lives he had sheltered had aired out the stagnant grief, leaving behind an echo of their warmth. The profound emptiness he had cultivated for so long now felt simply quiet. He closed the door and walked back to the hearth, the gift feeling like a strange and potent artifact in his hands. He sat down in his worn chair, the fire crackling softly, and placed the bundle on his lap. For a moment, he simply looked at it, turning it over and over. The deerskin was worn smooth with use, and the leather thong that bound it was tied with a simple, practical knot. Whatever this was, it was not an object of mere decoration. It was something with a purpose. With careful fingers, he untied the thong. The leather was supple beneath his touch. He slowly unfolded the deerskin, revealing the contents within. It was not what he expected. There was no food, no tool, no finely beaded ornament. Instead, there were 2 objects, nestled together on the soft hide. The first was a stone. It was small enough to fit in his palm, a piece of dark, smooth river rock, worn into a perfect oval by centuries of flowing water. It was an ordinary stone, but for one detail, etched into its surface was a single, clean, deliberate line, a scratch that ran from one end to the other, dividing it perfectly in 2. It was a mark of intention, a scar given with purpose. The second object was a small leather pouch, cinched tight with a sinew cord. He loosened the tie and tipped the contents into his palm. It was not herbs or tobacco or pigments. It was a coarse, dark mixture of ash and seeds. He sifted it through his fingers. The ash was fine and grey, like the ghost of a fire. The seeds were tiny and black, hard little kernels of dormant life. He looked at the 2 items lying in his hand, the scarred stone, the mixture of death and life. It was a puzzle. A riddle. It was a gift with no obvious meaning. He thought of the woman's eyes, the way she had looked through him. This was not a random offering. It was specific. It was for him. He sat there for a long time, the firelight warming his face, the weight of the stone in one hand, the gritty texture of the ash and seeds in the other. And then, slowly, like the sun rising over a dark valley, understanding began to dawn. The stone was not for keeping, it was for breaking. The line was a guide. The ash was not just ash, it was the remains of something that had burned, something sacred that had been offered to the fire. And the seeds were not for eating, they were for planting. This was not an object. It was an instruction. The woman had not just thanked him for saving her children. She had seen his prison, she had seen the ghost he worshipped, and she had given him a key. A way out. She had given him a ritual. A ceremony for the releasing of a spirit and the planting of a new hope. The revelation settled over him not with a crash, but with a deep, resonant hum, like a bell struck once in a vast, empty chamber. He was a man holding a map, and for the first time in 5 years, he knew the direction he had to travel. It was not a journey across the snow-covered land, but a journey of a few hundred feet, to the small, windswept bluff behind his cabin where a single, unmarked mound of stones lay beneath a towering pine. It was her grave. A place he had built but could not bring himself to visit. A place he meticulously avoided, circling it in his daily routines as if it were ringed with fire. He had buried her body there, but he had carried her ghost with him, refusing to let her rest. Now, he knew what he had to do. He stood, his movements filled with a somber resolve. He walked to the small table where the unfinished carving of his wife's face lay. He picked it up, his thumb stroking the smooth, blind curve of her cheek one last time. It was the most precious thing he owned, the anchor of his grief, the icon at the center of his lonely religion. And he knew it had to be destroyed. He carried the carving, the scarred stone, and the pouch of ash and seeds out into the brilliant, cold afternoon. The air was still and sharp, and his breath plumed in front of him. He walked to the bluff, his boots crunching in the snow, each step a final, decisive break with the past 5 years of stasis. He stood before the grave, a simple cairn of river stones he had assembled with numb hands so long ago. He knelt in the snow. He looked at the carving, at the face that was both a comfort and a curse. He whispered her name, just once, the sound a rough, unfamiliar stone in his throat. Then, he placed the carving on a large, flat rock. He took the dark, scarred stone from his pocket. He held it in his hand, its weight a solemn promise. He raised it high, and with a single, powerful blow, he brought it down upon the carving. The sound of the pine splitting was sharp and clean, a gunshot in the profound silence. He struck it again and again, his breath coming in ragged gasps, not with rage, but with a focused, agonizing grief. He shattered the beautiful face, splintering the wood until it was nothing but a pile of jagged shards and pale dust. Tears streamed down his face, freezing on his beard. They were the first tears he had shed since the day he had laid her here. He was not destroying her memory. He was setting it free. He was setting himself free. When it was done, he gathered the wooden dust and splinters into his palm and mixed them with the sacred ash and the tiny black seeds from the pouch. He held the mixture in his hand, a potent alchemy of love, loss, life, and death. He used the sharp edge of another stone to dig a small hole in the frozen earth at the head of the grave. It was hard work, his fingers numb, the ground resisting him. But he persisted. Into that small, dark space, he poured the mixture. His sorrow. His love. His hope. He covered it with the cold earth, his hands pressing the soil down with a final, gentle benediction. The gift had been used. The ritual was complete. He had finally laid his ghost to rest. He did not feel a sudden, miraculous lightness. The grief was not gone. It had simply changed its shape. The heavy, unmovable stone he had carried in his chest for 5 years had been broken apart, ground into soil, and planted. It was a part of him now, not as a dead weight, but as a fertile ground for something new. In the weeks that followed, a subtle shift occurred in the rhythm of his life. He still rose with the sun, still checked his snares, still tended his fire. But the crushing inertia was gone. His movements were lighter, his gaze less fixed on the past. He began to notice things he hadn't in years, the intricate patterns of frost on his windowpane, the cheerful, chattering call of a chickadee in the pines, the way the afternoon light turned the snow on the distant peaks to a soft, rosy pink. The mountain was no longer just a mirror for his emptiness, it was a world teeming with a quiet, resilient life, and he was a part of it. He took the 2 halves of the broken river stone and placed them on the mantelpiece above his fire. They were not a trophy, but a reminder. A testament to the fact that some things must be broken before they can be used to heal. The cabin felt different, too. The oppressive silence had been replaced by a peaceful quiet. He found himself humming sometimes, low, tuneless sounds that surprised him when he heard them. He had thought his voice was lost to him forever. One day, he found himself with a new block of wood in his hands. He began to carve, but this time, it was not a face. It was a bird, a hawk with its wings outstretched, its head turned toward the sky. His hands moved with a new freedom, a new purpose. He was no longer trying to capture a memory. He was creating something that wanted to fly. The world was slowly, tentatively, returning to him, not as it was before, but as something new, something tempered by loss but not defined by it. The true transformation was quiet, internal, a slow green shoot pushing its way up through frozen ground. He had been given a gift not of an object, but of a path. A way to walk with his sorrow instead of being buried by it. He had learned that the deepest connections are often silent, forged not in words, but in a shared glance, a simple gesture, an act of selfless care. The Apache woman and her children had passed through his life like a storm, but they had not left devastation in their wake. They had left the cleansing, quiet peace that follows, and the promise of new growth in the spring. He had been a man drowning in a sea of memory, and they had not pulled him out. They had simply taught him how to swim. When the last of the snow had melted and the mountain had shrugged off its white mantle to reveal the tender green of new life, Elias walked back to the bluff behind his cabin. The air was soft and smelled of damp earth and pine needles. A gentle breeze whispered through the trees. He approached the small, unmarked grave, his heart calm. He knelt, his eyes searching the dark soil where he had performed the ritual. And there it was. Pushing up through the earth was a small, determined shoot of green. And at its tip, a single, tightly furled bud. It was a mountain wildflower, one known for its resilience, a species that could find purchase in the rockiest, most unforgiving soil. It was not a grand or showy bloom, but a small, humble testament to the stubborn, unyielding power of life. He stayed there for a long time, watching the small flower as if it were the most wondrous thing in the world. And perhaps it was. It was his grief, his love, his hope, all of it given back to him by the earth, transformed into a simple, beautiful, living thing. He did not touch it. He simply watched it, a quiet witness to its becoming. A peace settled over him, so profound and so complete that it felt like grace. He was still a man of the mountain, a man of silence. But the silence was no longer an absence. It was a presence. It was the quiet hum of a world reborn. We are all, in our own way, keepers of a wound. We build our lives around it, we protect it, we sometimes even come to worship its familiar ache. We believe its walls keep us safe, until one day we realize we are trapped inside. But the universe is compassionate in its ferocity. It sends storms. It sends the cries of others. It sends messengers who see the truth of us and offer not a cure, but a key. A small, strange gift shrouded in mystery, an instruction for a ritual we did not know we needed to perform. The greatest gifts are not the ones we keep on a shelf, but the ones that demand we break something, that we give something away, that we dig our hands into the cold earth and plant our own sorrow. For it is only then, in that act of surrender, that we discover the truth, that grief, like love, is not an ending. It is a seed.